This is a course in Jewish ethics, and two events occurred to me which sort of stimulated me to put together such a course. The first was reading an article which was published by a philosophy professor in Massachusetts who teaches ethics. And this article begins by her reporting that in a social ethics course given by one of her colleagues, there was a problem. The problem was that the students in this social ethics course, at the end of the course, all admitted to cheating on the final exam. And when the professor said to them, "Didn't you learn anything in this course?" the students said, "We're just following what we learned in this course, because you taught us there is the possibility of moral choice, and cheating is one of the choices. So that's what we learned in the course." And the professor was very upset, and she told her friend, and her friend, this other professor, wrote an article about it, and this article is one of the readings in the course packet. The second event was reported in a journal called Publishers Weekly, which is for writers and publishers, about another philosophy professor who wrote a book, and the name of the book was, the proposed title was Telling the Truth. The book was about how one should tell the truth. The book was accepted by a very prestigious publisher in New York, and the book was in production, in the factory, being printed. And meanwhile, one of the graphics guys at the publishing house was finishing up the dust jacket for the book. And he decided he needs, for the back of the book, a few blurbs. So he looks in the file, and he sees that when this philosophy professor submitted the manuscript for the book, he also submitted letters of recommendation from very prestigious philosophy professors as to why a publisher should publish this book. So the guy in the graphics department calls up one of the very famous professors who wrote an endorsement for the book and says to him, "I'm just simply calling to ask your permission to use an excerpt from the letter you sent endorsing this book for a blurb for the back of the cover." And the very famous philosophy professor says, "I never sent such a letter." And the guy in the graphics department says, "But I have here on my desk a letter with the stationery of your university with your signature endorsing this book." He says, "I don't recall. Maybe I sent it, but I don't recall sending any such letter. And I don't know who wrote this book." He tells him, he says, "I don't even know this guy." So the graphics guy figures, well, maybe he forgot he wrote the letter. So he calls the next guy whose letter is in the file. Another very famous philosophy professor. Same thing happens. And he calls the next guy. There were three letters, and none of them remembered, because none of them sent in a letter endorsing this book about how you should always tell the truth. In other words, the guy who wrote the book on how to tell the truth lied in order to get the book on how to tell the truth published. So they stopped the presses, and the book was never printed. It's a true story. So these two episodes convinced me that we have to try to come to some understanding of the nature of ethics and how it should be taught. So here's the title I would give for this course. Rather than Jewish ethics, here's my alternate title. One of the best-selling authors in the United States today is Dennis Rodman. Right? It's on the bestseller list, his book. What's the book called? Bad as I Want to Be. I would change one word and make it the title of this course, Good as I Want to Be. And then I went down to the bookstore the other day, and I found my colleague, Harold Kushner, already beat me to the punch and wrote such a book, Good as I Want to Be, something like this. Now, I want now to move to the issue of what is Jewish ethics and what is not Jewish ethics. But I want to preface this with a little story, actually two. I was recently in Israel, and I want to tell you two stories I heard there, one of which has nothing to do with Jewish ethics, but it's short. And the other one has nothing, but it actually, you'll see it does. We were discussing there Netanyahu. And the Israelis asked me, how is his English? I said, his English is really good. So one of them said to me, you know, after the Yom Kippur War in '73, Golda Meir came to Washington to see Richard Nixon, to thank him for airlifting all the military stuff, hardware to Israel, which really saved them. So she came with the foreign minister of Israel, Abba Eban. So here's four people sitting in the Oval Office. Golda Meir, Abba Eban, Richard Nixon, and Henry Kissinger. So Nixon, trying to show how pro-Jewish he is, says to Golda Meir, you see, Madam Prime Minister, both of us have Jewish foreign ministers. And Golda Meir looks at Nixon and she says, pointing to Eban, but mine speaks English better than yours. That has nothing to do with Jewish ethics. Here's a story that does.
Eban and who?
And Golda Meir. Here's a second story, which has something to do with Jewish ethics, is also about Golda Meir. Golda Meir, when she was Prime Minister of Israel, for some reason wanted de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, to visit Israel. She worked on it many years, finally convinced him to come to Israel. So he came, went around the country, viewed the country, was very impressed, and he was about to leave, and she said to him, is there anything else we can show you here in Israel before you leave? So de Gaulle says, well, you know, I find it a little strange, because when people come to France, when dignitaries come to France, they're always shown the tomb of the unknown soldier. And I've been in Israel now some time, and I want to pay my respects at the tomb of the unknown soldier. So before I leave, I'd like to do that. Now at that time, in the 70s, there was no tomb of the unknown soldier in Israel. Now there is. So Golda Meir, not wanting to disappoint him, says, okay, on your way to the airport, there's a cemetery. That's where our tomb of the unknown soldier is. We'll stop there, you'll pay your respects, you'll get on the plane, you'll go home. So he left very happy. After he leaves, one of her adjutants comes over to her and says, but Golda, we don't have a tomb of the unknown soldier. So she says to him, look, on the way to the airport, there's a cemetery. Find there some nice, well-tended grave. Get some wreaths and put it in front of the tombstone so we don't see what's written there. Put up a sign, Israel's tomb of the unknown soldier. Put up a few flags, and we'll have a ceremony. De Gaulle will be happy. So the motorcade comes out to the cemetery. There's the flags. There's a sign, tomb of the unknown soldier. They have a military guard. They fire the guns. They have a rally, a volley of guns. They play the Hatikva, Israeli national anthem. Everybody's happy. De Gaulle is happy, and he turns around, just about to get back in the limousine to go to the airport, when a wind comes, and it blows the wreaths away from the tombstone, revealing what's written there. And what's written there is something like this. here lies Mr. Hyman Schwartz of Cincinnati, Ohio. A loving father, a caring husband, a great industrialist, and a friend of Israel. So de Gaulle looks at the tombstone and reads it, and he says to Golda, I thought you told me this is the tomb of the unknown soldier. So Golda says to him, well, you see, as a loving father, this guy, Mr. Schwartz, was very well known. As a great industrialist in Cincinnati, he was very well known. And as a friend of Israel, he was very well known. But as a soldier, he was unknown. So he's our unknown soldier. Now, the reason I tell you this story is because I would suggest to you that Jewish ethics is a field that is really unknown. Despite the fact that many people write about it, and many people talk about it, and many people and organizations, mostly Jewish organizations, claim to have positions that are derived from it and speak for it, it's really, I think, an area that is really unknown. And because it's unknown, many people have many misconceptions about what it is. So what I want to do now is to focus on some things Jewish ethics, at least it seems to me, is not, and then to discuss what it is, and then to discuss how it applies to certain particular ethical problems. The first thing we have to do is to make a distinction between two things that the term Jewish ethics can denote. One is the ethics of Jews, and the other is the ethics of Judaism. Now, you can determine the ethics of Jews based on sociological data. In other words, the ethics of Jews is a sociological category. And if you want to see what it is, you just find out what it is through empirical observation, through description of behavior based on the observation of attitudes and behaviors of Jews. Very simple. But the ethics of Judaism is discernible through another way altogether. And that is through the study of the sacred and significant literature of the Jewish religion in terms of how it treats moral issues. In other words, the ethics of Judaism, by definition, is the ethics of the Jewish religion, and therefore it is a form of religious or theological ethics that rests on and articulates certain religious assumptions and teachings. And so that whereas the ethics of Jews is descriptive, it describes what people do, the ethics of Judaism is prescriptive. In other words, it tells you, it prescribes what Jewish religion says people ought to do or should do. And what I'm suggesting is, and it may come as somewhat of a shock to some of you, that the two of these meanings of the term Jewish ethics, namely the ethics of Jews and ethics of Judaism, are not necessarily the same thing. And I would suggest even further that more often than not, they're not the same thing. And that what I am concerned about here for our discussion is not Jewish ethics in terms of the ethics of Jews. What I'm concerned here is in the ethics of Judaism. Now, why can we not necessarily assume that the ethics of Jews, particularly American Jews, is the same as the ethics of Judaism? And what I would suggest is based on a premise. And the premise is that Judaism is not simply a way of living, which it is, but is also a way of thinking. And what I would suggest further is that most Jews do not think in a Jewish way, and do not think about Judaism in a Jewish way. And therefore, when they think about ethical issues, they think about them in non-Jewish ways, but think that they are thinking about them in Jewish ways. In other words, when we evaluate whether the ethics of Judaism is correlative with the ethics of Jews, we need to see how Jews are thinking about moral issues, how Jews undertake the process of ethical decision-making, and then we have to compare that to how Judaism does the same thing. We need to clarify what are the categories that Jews think in, what are the categories of Judaism, and what is the relationship between those two as it applies to ethical issues. So consider for a minute this statement that sort of sums up what I've just said. In the 19th century, in eastern Poland, there was a very famous Hasidic rabbi named the Rabbi of Kutsk. His name was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Morgenstern of Kutsk. And he said the following, which is relevant to our discussion. He said, "It's bad enough to be in the exile." The Hebrew word for exile there is galut. It's bad enough to be in the exile, but it's even worse for a person to be in the exile and not even know they're in the exile. In other words, what does it mean? The word in Hebrew, galut, or exile, can also be translated in a more modern English as a state of alienation. Not being where you're supposed to be. So we can translate his statement something like this. It's bad enough not to be where you're supposed to be, but it's even worse not to be where you're supposed to be and think you're supposed to be. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that most Jews, particularly most American Jews, not only think in non-Jewish categories, but they think in non-Jewish categories about Jewish issues and don't even know it. In other words, we think about issues in Jewish ethics in non-Jewish ways and then think that's Jewish ethics. Or to put it another way, we are Jews in non-Jewish ways, especially as it relates to moral issues, because we are culturally assimilated to non-Jewish ways of thinking that we then equate with being Jewish ways of thinking. Got that? Nobody's throwing anything at me, so I'm not so sure you got that. It's a very radical idea. I don't know if you ever thought about this before. I'm only bringing it up because, as you'll see, it relates to our subject in a very visceral way. And I'll give you many examples to try to prove it, which will upset you more. Now, let me give you a kind of analogy to express this idea. You know, there are people who have English as a second language. What I would suggest to you is that American Jews have Judaism as a second language. Maybe not even as a second language. Maybe as a fifth language. And if you have Judaism as a second language, and you don't know the vocabulary of that language very well, you don't know the grammar of that language very well, do you really speak that language? Is it really even a second language? So what I want to do is I want to take some examples from the realm of ethics and deal with the vocabulary. And I'll give you some examples. First example I want to give you is a term you hear a lot of, particularly in an election year, and that is the term Judeo-Christian ethics. You've all heard this term? Many people appeal to what they are calling the Judeo-Christian ethic, right? The first question is, what's the first question?
What does it mean?
No, that's the second question.
How can it be?
No. Is it?
Who invented it?
That's already a very sophisticated question. A simpler question, does it exist? Is there such a thing? People are talking about it. If I started talking about a purple elephant sitting here, you would say, does it exist? People talk about Judeo-Christian ethics. Is there such a thing? Now, that leads us to one approach, which is the approach you suggest. What is the history of it? Here's the history of it, very simple. In the 19th century, this term begins to become popular. It becomes popular from the Jewish point of view for a different reason than it becomes popular from the Christian point of view. The Jewish point of view is something like this. We Jews are being denied equal socio-political rights in the countries in which we're living, say Western and Eastern Europe. We want same socio-political rights as everybody else. One of the ways we're going to get it is to show the powers that be that we are not different than everybody else. How are we going to do that? One of the ways we can do that is by showing that our beliefs and our values are the same as everybody else. So Jews, therefore, embrace the idea of a Judeo-Christian ethic. In other words, that Judaism and Christianity have the same ethic. One of the most popular definitions by Jews of Judaism in the 19th century, particularly in Germany, as some of you know, was Judaism is ethical monotheism. Namely, Judaism is monotheism, there's the belief in one God, and it's ethical. It has certain moral values. Well, what's the big deal with this definition? The big deal with this definition is a way of saying we're no different than you. It doesn't say Judaism happens to be the religion of a certain people. See, the whole particularistic issue was taken away. The whole nationalistic issue was taken away. It was an attempt to show more what we have in common with everybody else than what distinguishes us from everybody else in order for us to get the same rights as everybody else had. Now, that's an oversimplification, but it's, I think, essentially correct. From the Christian perspective, there was another agenda. The Christian perspective wanted to show the continuity between Christianity and Judaism. So they say Judeo-Christian ethic. Namely, Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism. So it's clearly a Christian perspective. And both groups use the term because both groups had an agenda for their own reasons why they should use the term. But the question still remains. We see why they used it, but does it exist? And I would suggest to you, it doesn't exist. There is no Judeo-Christian ethic. Why? Because there is a Jewish ethic and there is a Christian ethic, and the two are very different. I will give you tonight some examples of how they're very different, but let me now give you just one example which might get you upset. But if you get upset, you think. And here's a very simple, oversimplistic distinction between Jewish ethics and Christian ethics, and it's something like this. I would suggest that Christian ethics is what you might want to call a messianic ethic. In other words, the basic premise in Christianity is that redemption has already come to the world in the person of Jesus Christ. So we're living in a messianic world since then. And we can therefore achieve in this messianic redeemed world certain messianic expectations. Let me give you an example of this. An example is that a few years ago, the Roman Catholic bishops of the United States published a pastoral letter on the economy. And in this letter, they call for an end to poverty and for full employment. This, in my view, is a messianic idea. Nowhere in this letter is the verse in the Bible quoted which says the poor will never desist out of the land. In other words, that in historical times there will always be poor people. This is a messianic idea that there'll be no poor people. Only in the messianic era does Judaism teach there'll be no poor people. But in the meantime, the poor will not desist out of the land. It says so right there in the Bible. They never quote it. So I would suggest they have a messianic ethic. What do Jews have? Jews have what I'd call not a messianic ethic, but a messy ethic. In other words, we begin with the assumption the world is not a messianic world. The world is not redeemed. And the world is a messy place. And ethics cannot proceed as if the world is redeemed. We have to proceed as if the world is yet to be redeemed, but in the meantime is a messy place. And therefore we have to deal with messy issues. And the Bible deals already with messy issues, like war, like murder, like robbery, like rape, like child abuse. They're all in the Bible. Because we are living in a pre-messianic world, a non-messianic world, a messy world. If we were living in a messianic world, the moral choices and the moral decisions would be different. But because we're living in a messy world, we need an ethics that works in a messy world. So this, I would suggest, again, oversimplified, is one of, in my view, the main distinctions between Jewish ethics and Christian ethics. Theirs is a messianic ethics, ours is a messy ethics. And this is one of the reasons why there is no Judeo-Christian ethics. Because there is a Jewish ethic that has a different view of the world, different assumptions, different method of decision making, and on many ethical issues, different conclusions than a Christian ethic. Now, it's often pointed out by those who take the position that there is a Judeo-Christian ethic that one of the proofs that there's a Judeo-Christian ethic is because Judaism and Christianity have the same Bible. Not exactly. First of all, the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, the Tanakh in Hebrew, called by Christians the Old Testament, some Christians the Old Testament, is only part of the Christian Bible. There's also the New Testament. So we don't have the same Bible, we only have part. And secondly, what is more important is that we have, Jews, a different interpretation of the same Bible that Christians have. And if you have completely different interpretations of the same text, do you have the same book? No. It's a different book because you understand it completely differently. So you don't have the same book. But more important here is an idea I'll repeat a little later and embellish on a little later. And that is, and it may shock some of you to hear it, Judaism is not the Bible. Judaism is not the Bible. Judaism is how the tradition of Judaism has interpreted the Bible since the Bible was written. It's not the Bible. You know the old saying of Daniel Webster, even the devil can quote scripture. One Jewish scholar said the devil can quote scripture, but the devil isn't smart enough to quote Talmud. We have the Talmud too. Talmud helps us tell us what the Bible means. So when we're talking about Jewish ethics, we're talking about how the tradition understood the Bible, not the Bible per se. And that interpretation, that understanding is different than a Christian understanding. Now, already in the writings of St. Paul in the New Testament, you have an idea that is also very influential in this notion of the Judeo-Christian ethic. And that is the idea that not only does the Judeo-Christian ethic come out of the Bible, namely the Hebrew Bible, but it comes out of only one particular part of the Hebrew Bible. In other words, you have the idea that the Bible, Hebrew Bible, has two sort of kinds of things in there. One is law, and the other is morality. Already, St. Paul said that the law, that's what the Jews deal with. That's no good. And morality, that's what the Christians deal with. That's the good stuff. And the morality comes from the prophets. Now, Jews in the 19th century, liberal Jews, said, well, by Judaism we mean exactly what they mean. Not the law, not the Talmud, because the classical Christian idea was that the rabbis of the Talmud corrupted the pure Judaism of the prophets. And Jews in the 19th century, many of them went along with this. And both groups said, what do we mean by the Judeo-Christian ethic? We mean the prophetic morality, not the law, not the Talmud, not the tradition. So obviously, Christians agreed with this because it was almost exactly the same thing St. Paul was teaching in the New Testament. What I'm suggesting is that to go along with the Judeo-Christian ethic, Jews perverted Judaism because they had their own socio-political agenda, which for them was very important. Now, let me give you another example. You have a very important ethical concern, charity. Another word for charity in English, philanthropy. What do these two terms mean? Where do they come from?
It comes from the Greek. Caritas and philo. They're Greek terms.
Okay, so for those of us who forgot our Greek, what does it mean?
Love.
Love.
Love and love, too.
Love of
I don't know what Thoropos is.
man, human beings.
Or-
Philanthropos, love of human beings. So, caritas, love. Philo, love. Anthropos, human being. Love of human beings. Now, do we have this idea? How would you translate, if you know Hebrew, this into Hebrew?
If you would.
If you would want to translate this into Hebrew, what is the corresponding value in Judaism to charity and philanthropy?
Give me the necessity.
Give it to me again? No, it's not. That's exactly the point, and let me tell you why. Suppose you're walking down the street here, and somebody comes up to you, and they're rather dirty, rather diseased, don't smell very nice. rather foreboding looking. And they ask you to help them out. Now, in this view, you should help them out. Why? Because charity means caritas. You love them. Philanthropy means love of the other person, love of the human being. You love them. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were walking down the street and I was accosted by somebody like this, it wouldn't be very easy to love them. We don't have. So, do we say, I should only help the person when I love him? What if I don't love him? What if he smells funny? I have problems loving people that smell funny. All right? Look funny. Suppose I don't want to love him. What do? I leave him alone. Now, we have, as some of you indicated, an idea in Judaism called tzedakah. That's not charity. It's not philanthropy. Tzedakah comes from the root tzedek, meaning righteousness. Righteousness means doing the thing because it's right. Not because you love him, because it's the right thing to do, because you have the resources to help him and he has the need. And here, I think, is a perfect example of the Messianic ethic and the Messianic ethic. A Messianic ethic tells you have to love everybody. And because you love everybody, you have to help everybody. But is that normal for people to love everybody? And if you love everybody, can you love anybody? In other words, if there's a person, say, who's a parent, and he loves all the children in the world the same way, does he really love his own child? So here you have a juxtaposition of ideas. Now, does this mean we in Jewish ethics do not have an idea of love or philanthropy or love of the other? Doesn't mean that. We do have an idea. We don't call it like this. We have another term. And the other term in Hebrew happens to be gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. But acts of loving kindness is above the requirements of the law. Is when you go above what you're required to do. When you love somebody who's hard to love, that's gemilut chasadim. When you help somebody who it's right to help, that's tzedakah. Now let me give you a third example. The most important philosopher in the modern period writing on ethics was, take a guess.
Spinoza.
Take another guess. Pardon me? I wouldn't put him in the philosopher department. Modern. Not Jewish.
Heidegger, well, not Jewish.
Don't give me Heidegger. I don't want Nazis. I don't want to go that far. A little bit earlier.
Kant.
Pardon me?
Kant.
Kant, yes. Or Chicagoans say Kant. Immanuel Kant lived in 18th century Germany, the greatest of the German philosophers. To be the greatest of the German philosophers is a great thing because, you know, for the Germans of this period, philosophy was like, you know, basketball is in America or something like this. So this was like Jordan, you know, in philosophy. Now, Kant developed a moral theory. It was very influential, influenced all of modern philosophy, down to our own times. And Kant was faced with this problem. Problem was that in the history of philosophy, philosophers tried to prove the existence of God. I won't get into the whole history of how they tried to do it, but Kant didn't like any of the proofs. So Kant spent a lot of time ripping apart all the proofs that all the philosophers who came before him had given for the existence of God. And then, very typical of a philosopher, Kant came up with his own proof after he destroyed all the other proofs. But what was typical was what he came up with to replace what he destroyed wasn't as good as he thought it was. And his proof for the existence of God, which is generally called the moral proof, moral argument for the existence of God, runs simply like this. We have, each of us, a moral sense within us which tells us what's right and wrong and pushes us toward the good, to do the right thing. Now, that couldn't have gotten inside of us from nowhere, but since it is inside of us, someone must have put it there, and that someone is God, and therefore God exists. Now, I've often thought that if Kant had lived 150, 200 years later, and had seen the Nazi concentration camps, he might not have said it. But he didn't live later, and he did say it. Now, this led Kant to the problem of what is a moral act. And Kant came up with the following idea. Kant said, number one, a moral act, to be moral, must be universal. It must be true of all situations, at all times. So, for example, if you have a moral rule, like telling the truth, you should always tell the truth, in all situations, at all times, at all places. This is what Kant called the categorical imperative. You may have heard this term. Categorical. If you haven't heard this term, imperative. In other words, it's the command to do things categorically, across the board, all the time. If you haven't heard this term, and your friends haven't heard it, you can impress them with it at cocktail parties. So the first idea is that if you have a moral rule, all times and all places, for all people, like telling the truth. The second idea was that in order to be a moral act, an act could not be imposed from without. It had to be generated from within. Therefore, for Kant, a law which is imposed from without cannot be moral. In other words, Kant makes a very sharp distinction here between law and morals. Law is that which is imposed from without, that which we do because some external authority imposes on us, with certain penalties if we don't do it. Moral act, on the other hand, comes from within. Comes as an act of free moral volition, of free moral choice. Now, I'm of course oversimplifying a lot here, because if you read Kant, you know you don't need sleeping pills for sure, and it'd take you about 3 hours to read 2 lines. But this, in a nutshell, is Kant's moral theory. Now, this theory became extremely influential. And the question is, where does Jewish ethics of Judaism fit into this? Now let's carry Kant's argument one step further. Kant wrote about Judaism. And based on his idea of what constitutes an ethical act, he came to the conclusion that Judaism is at best an amoral religion and at worst an immoral religion. And Kant, therefore, in one of his minor writings, called for what he termed the euthanasia of Judaism. In other words, he said, if the function of a religion is to teach people to act morally, and Judaism is either amoral or immoral, then what do we need it for? In itself, it's a sort of harmless statement, except for the fact, as I mentioned to you before, that in Germany, philosophy is like basketball here, and people take philosophers seriously. And when the Nazis came to power, Kant, who was, the Michael Jordan of, philosophy, said, euthanasia of Judaism, and you can see where that led. Now, why did Kant take this position, which, from his point of view was simply coming out of the logic of the argument? He took this point of view because he looked at Judaism, and he said to himself, what is this Judaism? So he says, well, I don't know what it is. I'll read up on it. Who did he read? He figured, well, none of them know about Judaism. I'll read Jews. Who will I read amongst the Jews? I'll read the Jewish philosophers, because they were philosophers like he was a philosopher. So who did he read? Someone mentioned it before. Spinoza. Spinoza wrote in Latin, so he could read Latin, no problem. Spinoza wrote in Hebrew, he had a problem. Spinoza wrote in Latin. And his own contemporary, Moses Mendelssohn, great Jewish philosopher of the 18th century. And both of them said the same thing, which was Judaism is a religion totally of law, devoid of ethics. So Kant, who says, in order for an act to be moral, it can't be in obedience to a law, and he's reading in Mendelssohn and Spinoza that the whole structure of Judaism is obedience to a law, he comes to the conclusion, well, if I'm right and they're right, then Judaism is not a moral religion. And then he reads further. What are these laws the Jews are obliged to observe, say like the dietary laws? They're laws given to Jews, right? Non-Jews don't have to observe the dietary laws. But, he says, for a law, in order to be moral, it has to be universal, has to be true for all people. He says, but this Jewish law is only, the Jews say, true for themselves, so therefore it doesn't meet his other criteria. And therefore, the two things that characterize Judaism, as far as he understood it, were in exact opposition to his idea of what morality was, and therefore he came to the conclusion that Judaism was immoral, or amoral. Now, if that all sounds strange to you, the next thing is even stranger. The Jews in Germany, or at least the Reform or liberal Jews in Germany, wrote about Jewish ethics. And where did they get their idea of what Jewish ethics is? From Kant. Believe it or not. And they came to the same conclusion, that this is what ethics is, and this is how they understood Judaism, so they perverted it. Now, this whole approach to ethics rests upon an assumption that is peculiarly modern, and almost all modern ethics is based on it. And that is the idea of what's called moral autonomy. In other words, that if an ethical act has to come from within the individual person, it means that the individual person, autonomously, by themselves, without any other authority, without any external law, without any external system of commandments, without any revelation from God, the person autonomously decides what's moral for him or herself. So here you had, in the 19th century, century after Kant, Reform Judaism developing in Germany, and developing an idea of Jewish ethics, and developing it right out of Kant. That in order to be moral, the act has to be universal. The act has to come from inside the person, be autonomous, and that the act could not be obedience to a law. This was the idea of Jewish ethics as it developed amongst Reformed Jews. Now, based on Kant. Now, if you compare this to the ethics of Judaism as it developed classically, which I'll have more to say about later, you see that this approach is absolutely the opposite, and indeed subversive of the ethics of Judaism. Why? First of all, because Jewish ethics, as we'll see, is what is generally called a rule ethic. In other words, it's an ethic where you have certain rules. For Kant, you can't have laws. You can't have rules. Secondly, it's a system where, as we'll see, the law represents the concretization of certain ethical ideas. In other words, there is no absolute sharp distinction between law and ethics. The two are interwoven. The law is simply a way of articulating the ethics. Now, let's leave this for a minute and go to another idea, which is part of our first language in the United States, in Western civilization, and particularly in Anglo-American culture, but which is not part of Jewish culture or language at all. And that is the idea of rights. When you discuss most ethical issues today in the United States, and most legal issues in the United States, it comes down always to an issue of rights. I have my rights, you have your rights, what happens if there's a conflict of the rights? It's always an issue of rights. Where does this idea of rights come from?
The Magna Carta.
Yeah, what's the Magna Carta all about?
Rights to the noblemen in England to take down the power of the king.
That's right. In other words, the king was originally the absolute sovereign. He had all the rights. He had the monopoly on rights. The nobility, they wanted some of the rights. So he gave them some of his rights. Now we don't have in the United States the nobility, so everybody has rights. In other words, the government surrenders the rights that were originally that of the sovereign, which originally was the king. So when you ask an ethical question, one of the ways you ask it in the Anglo-American parlance is, what are my rights? Now I suggest to you that in classical Hebrew and in classical Jewish thought, there is no term for rights and there is no concept of rights. In other words, that ethics of Judaism is not rights-centered, but rather obligation-centered. The primary question is not what are my rights, but what am I obliged to do and what am I permitted to do? Not what are my rights to do. So, for example, in the American system, we're always talking about, say, the Bill of Rights. First 10 Bill of Rights. But in the Jewish system, what do we talk about? The 10 Commandments. They're not rights, 10 Commandments. They're commandments. They tell you what you're obliged to do, what you're permitted to do. So do all the other commandments. Not what your rights are. So how you frame any ethical question is already leading you towards some kind of answer. And if you frame that question in terms of what are my rights, you're going to be led one place. And if you phrase the question in terms of what are my obligations or what am I permitted to do, you're going to be led another place. Let me give you an example on an issue that I know is a very tender issue and which I'll discuss more in great detail another time. but just to touch on it simply here. And that is the abortion debate. How is the abortion debate framed in this country?
By woman's self-determination.
Choice.
What choice?
Right of her own body.
Right to choose.
Right of choice. Okay. And what's the other one? I can see where all of you stand here. What's the other one? Right to life. So here you have two positions on the question of abortion, and the framing of the question is in terms of rights. Right to choice, right to life. Now, let me give you a case that appears in Jewish law in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and ask you where ethics of Judaism comes down between right to choice or right to life. Okay? Here's the case. The true case. A woman is about to be married. She goes to her physician for a checkup. The physician says to her, I know you're about to be married, but don't become pregnant. Use everything you can do not to become pregnant. The woman says, why? The physician says, because there is no doubt medically that if you would carry a pregnancy to term, it would kill you. The woman gets married, and somewhere along the way she decides that she wants to have a child. She becomes pregnant. She never tells her husband about what the doctor told her. She goes to the doctor because she has suspicions she's pregnant. The doctor says, you're pregnant and we must abort within the next 6 weeks, because if it goes beyond that, I told you before, it will kill you. There's no medical doubt about it. And the woman says, I don't care. I would rather die than not leave a child behind. I don't care if I die in delivery. I don't care if I die carrying the pregnancy, even if it doesn't last the term. Child possibility is more important to me than life. So I choose to die. Now, the doctor forces her to go to a rabbinic court. The rabbinic court tells her, you are obliged to have the abortion because your life takes precedent over the fetus's life. And what you're doing is committing suicide, and you were warned in advance, and now we have to take action to prevent you from dying, and there is no guarantee that the baby would survive you, and you are risking your life by carrying through with this pregnancy. Now, is this a case of right to choice, or is it a case of right to life?
Choice.
Neither.
Neither.
Why?
Because, or you could say the opposite, you could say both. In other words, it's
Her right to life.
her choice. She chooses to die. So it's pro-choice, anti-life, anti-her life, but pro the baby's life. But we don't know if the baby will survive. And it's pro-life because it's pro the baby's life, but it's not anti-life because it's anti-her life, but it's still pro-choice because she's making the choice. In other words, the reason I give this particular example is to suggest that the terms are meaningless. In other words, that it's an arbitrary category. It's an arbitrary division. Because if it can't be applied to a real case and work, and you come up with contradictory answers, these categories don't work. How would they be applied, say, in the ethics of Judaism? The question is not choice or life. The question is, what is the choice and whose is the life? In other words, it's not always either or. It depends. What is the choice? You want to have right to choice? What is the choice? And you want to have right to life? Question is, whose is the life? So you can categorically come down on this side or this side, because the way the question is asked already prejudices you toward an answer. What you have here is a more flexible way of looking at it, and I'll get more into detail when we discuss the issue of abortion. But the reason I raise this is for two purposes. One is to say that ethics of Judaism does not begin with the question of rights. It begins with the question of what is required and what is permitted, not with the question of the rights, and that the categories given by a rights system don't work all the time. Now, another example that I want to give in terms of categories that don't really work, in terms of ethics of Judaism, and you're not as upset by now as I thought you would be, so maybe this will do it, and that are the categories which are very relevant in an election year, of liberal and conservative. These categories are not found anywhere within classical Jewish literature. But the reason I mention these is because, again, of the distinction I began with between the ethics of Jews and the ethics of Judaism. Sociologically, the ethics of Jews is always liberal. All the polls show that. Leonard Fine, one of the great observers of the American Jewish scene, once said, for Jews, their religion is Judaism and their denomination is liberalism. But I would suggest to you that liberalism uses categories that are not part of the ethics of Judaism. I'll give you some simple examples. One example I already gave, namely autonomy. Another is secularism, because if the ethics of Judaism is a theological ethic, a religious ethic, then it's not a secular ethic, and liberalism is a secular ethic. And universalism. And two more examples, and then we'll take a little break. The first example is an approach to ethics, to ethical problems, that is comparatively new, comparatively recent. And many sociologists have called this the therapeutic approach. In other words, the idea that in making ethical decisions, our basic vocabulary is not whether a deed is good or bad or right or wrong, but rather our basic vocabulary is taken from psychology or from medicine. Is an act healthy or unhealthy? You've heard this before? It's not new to you. In other words, you have a problem. This problem, historically, usually, in the past, has always been defined as a moral problem. Now the question is defined as a therapeutic problem. Not is it right or wrong, but is it healthy or not healthy? Does it meet my needs now, or doesn't it meet my needs now? Or if you want to put it in the management language, are you comfortable with it or not? You know, I always have this idea in my mind that, you know what the Wannsee Conference was?
No.
The Wannsee Conference was the meeting outside of Berlin on January 20th, 1942, in which the plan to exterminate all of the Jews of Europe was announced. And I just have this idea in my mind of Adolf Eichmann standing in front of the group with Reinhard Heydrich and Himmler and all the rest, and somebody saying, well, Colonel Eichmann, are you comfortable with this plan? Because that's how it would be done today. In other words, not a moral criteria, but a a management criteria. Or let me give you another problem. The therapeutic approach often has the view that when somebody does something that you might consider right or wrong, particularly wrong, it's not wrong because they're not responsible for what they're doing. In other words, for a person to be considered doing something morally wrong, they have to have had the choice to do it. The whole idea of morality, moral choice, rests on the idea that there is a freedom of choice between options. If a person has no choice, then you can't say that they made the morally wrong choice, right? A person has no choice, they can't have made the wrong choice, and therefore they can't have done anything morally wrong. Follow that? Now, I would suggest that part of this therapeutic, what I'm calling the therapeutic approach, others call it too, I didn't invent it, is the idea that people who do things that may be considered morally wrong are doing them because they have no choice, and therefore they're not morally wrong. Let me give you an example. Any of you attorneys here? Only one? You know what the Twinkie defense is? You know what the Twinkie defense is. Okay, why don't you tell us what the Twinkie defense is?
It was how forget his name.
Doesn't matter.
When the mayor of San Francisco was murdered, Moscone, the way that the fellow Daniel White got off was through the Twinkie defense, that he was not held responsible for his actions because of how he'd been so affected by eating Twinkies.
By eating Twinkies.
Right.
That was his defense. He said, my mother fed me Twinkies when I was a kid, and I am a diabetic. And when you feed Twinkies, too many Twinkies to a diabetic, they get crazy. And every time I eat Twinkies, I get crazy. So don't blame me that I shot the mayor. It's the Twinkies that made me do it. That's the Twinkie defense. This is a real defense in an American court. I'm not making it up.
Was he let free?
Was he let free? No, he wasn't let free, but
he served a very, very short amount of time, just a few years, even though he had very obviously murdered and wounded other people.
But let me give you some examples where people are set free and freed from responsibility. You've heard of the ADA?
ADA?
Yes. ADA.
American Dental Association?
Well, that's one ADA. That's not the one I have in mind. The Americans with Disabilities Act, right? That if you have a disability, you have certain rights above other people who don't have them, because you don't have certain free will in certain areas. Now, if you have certain syndromes, you're considered as having certain disabilities. And let me give you examples. And there is a book. The name of the book, and if any of you psychologists, the name of the book, in case you want to go out and get it right away, is called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 3rd edition revised, published by the American Psychiatric Association. There you find a list of all of the mental disabilities. If you have any of these, pardon me? Oh, we're up to 4? Okay. If you have any of these, you can claim that you're being discriminated against for having these disorders and disabilities. Let me give you some examples. A man with an affinity for gambling with other people's money is fired from his job. He sues the employer on the grounds that compulsive gambling is a handicap and is therefore protected by federal law and is restored to his job. Second example. A person is fired for consistently showing up late at work. They sue their employer on the grounds that they suffer from a disability. The name of the disability, listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, is called chronic lateness syndrome. Okay, here is an exchange that went on in a Pennsylvania court. This is from a court record in Pennsylvania. A psychiatrist is on the stand as an expert witness. He's asked, "Doctor, it's true, is it not, that people with what you have termed a personality disorder exist around us every day in all walks of life? Isn't that correct?" The answer of the doctor, "I am not sure any of us are spared that diagnosis." In other words, everybody has a disability.
Right.
Now, if everybody has a disability, then nobody is responsible for what they do, right? This is why,
Is there a difference between mental disabilities and physical disabilities?
yes, there is a difference,
So I thought
but not in terms of,
the Disability Act was for physical disabilities.
the American with Disability Act was originally for people with physical disabilities, but was expanded. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that you have a trend, which is a trend trying to say that if people are victims, they're not choosing. And if they're not choosing, they're not responsible for what they do. And that this approach has become sort of certified by the medical establishment, or the psychiatric establishment, however you want to put it. If you look at that problem from the point of view of the ethics of Judaism, you see a different approach altogether, which is the approach that since moral choice is meaningless without the ability to choose, without moral volition, you can't have ethics unless you have choice. And therefore you have a very strong emphasis throughout the history of Judaism on the idea that one of the characteristics, indeed one of the primary characteristics of the human being, is that the human being has moral choice. And I'll give you simply 2 examples. One is found in the Talmud, in the tractate Midah, page 16b. There you have a story that there are many angels, and each angel is a specialist. Some angels are in charge of, illness, and some angels are in charge of childbirth, and some angels are in charge of dreams. But there is an angel who is in charge of conception, of children. And this angel is called in Hebrew Lila, which means the night. So the Talmud says, there is an angel appointed over conception, and its name is Lila. It takes a seminal drop, a drop of semen, and sets it before God and asks. In other words, when the fetus is being created, the fetus is brought up before God at the moment of conception by this angel, and the angel asks God the following questions. The angel says, God, what is to become of this child? Is it to develop into a person who is strong or a person who is weak? And God makes a decree, whether it'll be strong or weak. Then the angel says, will it develop into a person who is wise or foolish? And then God makes a decree, wise or foolish. And then the angel says, will it develop into a person who is rich or who is poor? And God makes a decree, rich or poor. And then finally the angel says, will the person born of this develop into one who is virtuous or one who is wicked? And God is silent. In other words, that the virtue, that moral choice, is not one of the things that is predetermined, not genetically determined, that this is something that lies in the province of the individual. And the reason you have such a strong position on this, taken in classical Jewish sources, is simply stated by the greatest of the medieval Jewish philosophers, namely Maimonides, in his legal code, the Mishnah Torah, where he simply says, if it were not for the idea of moral choice, the Torah, namely Judaism, would have no meaning. In other words, what you have in the Torah? That you have to make certain choices. If you took away that possibility of choice, then the religion would have no meaning. What is it there for? The final example of a term or an idea that shows the distinction between the ethics of Judaism or the Jewish vocabulary and other vocabularies has to do with an idea that finds its roots in Plato. Plato developed the idea in his philosophy that the beautiful is the good. I would say that in Jewish sources we have the opposite, which is that the good is the beautiful. See the difference? Let me give you an example. I have a colleague who's writing a dictionary. It's a very strange dictionary because it's a bilingual dictionary, English-Yiddish. Now, in most bilingual dictionaries, you have on one side the word in language A, and on the other side the equivalent in language B. Except the dictionary he's writing is a dictionary of terms in language A that happen to be Yiddish, which are untranslatable in language B, literally, which happens to be English. So I asked him, give me an example of such a term. Any of you know a little Yiddish? You have a term a schöner Mensch. Now literally means a beautiful person. Now, suppose here is standing a person who is very ugly, hunchback, boils, I mean just, Bela Lugosi or something, Quasimodo. You could yet say about such a person that he is a schöner Mensch in Yiddish, a beautiful person. Why? Because the judgment is on what he does, on the kind of life he leads, rather than how he looks. So for us, it's not that the beautiful is the good, it's the good is the beautiful. And that for us, life, the ultimate art form, is life. And the ultimate building blocks of that art form are the moral virtues. In other words, one way I would define the ethics of Judaism is the creation of life as an art form. And I'll have more to say about this a little later. In other words, the idea is that for Judaism, ethics is aesthetics. As opposed to a distinction between ethics and aesthetics. But the opposite is not true, namely that aesthetics is not ethics. Let me give you an example of what that means. Because you have another view that's very popular today, and I'm going to discuss it more in detail a little later, and that is the idea that ethics is a matter of taste. For example, it's something, you're not sure something's ethical or not ethical, you say, yeah, it's ethical. Why is it ethical? Because I like it. Just like if someone asks you, well, here's chocolate ice cream and here's vanilla ice cream, which is good? Vanilla. Why? Because I like it. This is a very popular approach to ethics today. Let me give you an example. Hemingway, Ernest, was asked, what is moral? What is something that's moral? He said, well, an act that you feel good afterwards, after you do it, is moral. And an act you don't feel good after it is probably immoral. But what does this mean? Let me give you an example. A student at Harvard was asked whether he thought torture and abuse of elderly people was moral or immoral. And his answer was, well, I don't particularly like it. It's not particularly my cup of tea, but it might turn somebody else on. In other words, this is the view that what is moral or what is immoral is simply a matter of
Turns you on.
personal taste. You know the expression in Latin, de gustibus non est disputandum? In matters of taste, we don't make disputes. In other words, if you say, I like vanilla ice cream and it's the best ice cream, I can't dispute this. So if I would reduce ethics to aesthetics, then it would mean if I said to you, I just love torturing people and pulling wings out of butterflies and stuff like this. There's no, if you reduce it to this, matter of personal preference, there's no comeback. Now, let me pose a question and then we'll take a break. Question is this. We have two extreme positions now on the plate in ethical theory in this country, actually in all countries, almost. One is the position of moral relativism. When taken to its extreme, moral relativism is moral anarchy. In other words, it simply becomes ethics is whatever a person thinks it is. On the other hand, we have moral absolutism, that the rules can never be broken, and the rules, like Kant said, are true for all times and all places. So the two questions I want to leave on the plate now are, number one, is there something in the middle? Is there an alternative? And secondly, where does the ethics of Judaism fall? Is it an absolutistic ethic? Is it a relativistic ethic? Or is it somewhere else? All right, so on that happy note, we'll take a break. Did all of you get a copy of the reading list and stuff? No? You see, I think, the problem with moral relativism and where it can lead, namely to a complete moral anarchy. This is what in philosophy is called the argument of the slippery slope. That once you go down the slope, you end up to the other extreme. In other words, once you say that there are no absolute rules and that everything is relative or everything is a matter of taste or something like this, then you end, or everything is a matter of moral autonomy, or everything is a matter of individual conscience, then you can end up in a position of complete moral anarchy. In the book of Joshua, they have a term for moral anarchy. And the verse in the book of Joshua says, everybody did what was right in his eyes. That's moral autonomy. Everybody does what's right in their eyes. This the Bible views as moral anarchy. Because if everybody does what's right in his eyes or her eyes, then what's right? Except from the individual's perspective, right? There's no right. It's everybody makes it up as they go along. That's the Bible's view of moral anarchy. So you might say, let's go to the other extreme. The other extreme is moral absolutism. But here, we also have problems. And let me give you an example. This is an example that's given by the great French existentialist philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. Any of you hear of him? Jean-Paul Sartre. He knew Kant's philosophy very well. And Sartre was involved during the Second World War in the French underground. So he gives an example. putting together Kant and the French underground. And it's like this. Here's his example of why you can't have an absolutistic ethic. He says like this. Suppose you have a guy who's a member of the French underground, and he's captured by the Nazis. And he's taken for interrogation. So he's being interrogated, say, by this German Wehrmacht captain. And the German Wehrmacht captain happens to have studied Kant. And this guy, before the war, was also a philosopher. He also studied Kant, the underground guy. So the Wehrmacht captain says to him, look, we both studied Kant. And we must both therefore agree that Kant is right, that there is the categorical imperative. And that one example of the categorical imperative is that a person must always tell the truth, no matter what the situation. Now, you don't want to go to the Gestapo and get tortured. And I don't want to send you to the Gestapo and get tortured. So I want to ask you one simple question. And if you agree with Kant that you should always tell the truth as a categorical imperative, and I agree, I'll ask the question, you'll answer the question, and everything will be fine. And the underground guy says, so what's the question? And the Wehrmacht captain says, where are your comrades hiding and what are their names? And the guy says, I'm not going to tell you. So he says, but you know where they're hiding and you know their names, right? And he says, yes, I do. He says, so you have to tell me the truth, because you should always tell the truth. And this, Sartre says, is an example of how the categorical imperative doesn't work. Because in this case, the guy shouldn't tell the truth. In this case, the guy should tell a lie. He should tell the Wehrmacht captain, yes, they're hiding in this place, and here's their names. And the place should be a lie, and the name should be a lie. Because if he told them the truth, they'd all be arrested and killed. So you shouldn't always tell the truth. Depends on the circumstances. That's the problem with moral absolutism. So here we have a problem. There are virtues, both to moral absolutism and moral relativism, but there are also severe liabilities. The severe liability of moral relativism is that it can degenerate into moral anarchy. The severe liability of moral absolutism is that if you follow the rules universally, you can end up doing something that, according to the categorical imperative, is morally right, but ends up with a result that's morally a disaster. So what do? Well, if you only have those two choices, you have a dilemma. Can't get out of it. But if you don't only have those choices, it's no dilemma. And what I would suggest to you, though you may be surprised to hear it, is that I would suggest that the ethics of Judaism is neither morally relativist or morally absolute, and just like all these other terms are relevant when applied to the ethics of Judaism, so are absolutism and relativism. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that we have no rules in Judaism? No, it doesn't mean that. We have rules. Does this mean we have no moral norms? No, we do have norms. Does this mean we have no laws? We do have laws. And we do have something else that Kant didn't think about, and those are commandments. We have commandments. But the question is, are they absolute? Do we have absolute commandments?
Some are and some aren't.
Well, take the Big Ten, right? You could say, well, the Ten Commandments, they're absolute, right? They're not. Why aren't they?
But in some ways, they're situational.
In some way?
They're situational.
What does that mean?
Well, they look at the circumstances surrounding the act.
Big steal.
Like?
Well, for example, a woman, if she's a widow, it may be different. A certain act might be different than if she is not a widow.
Well, what does that have to do with the Ten Commandments? It doesn't discuss widows in the Ten Commandments.
Well, but I think that it,
I'm just limiting it to these 10 for purposes of our discussion.
well, thou shalt not murder, all right.
Yeah.
But-
Oh, you can murder a widow?
No, I'm moving off of widow because it didn't seem very appropriate.
All right, so who can you murder?
In war?
It's self-defense.
Self-defense.
Then it's not murder.
That's not murder, that's killing.
All right, so that's the first issue. But that's the second issue. Let me go back to the first issue. The first issue is that to have an absolute, it can't be challenged by something else. In other words, you can't have 10 absolutes. Because what happens if one absolute is in contradiction with another absolute? Let me give you an example that is already given by the Talmudic rabbis, all right, on the 10 Commandments. You have a commandment, honor the father and mother, right? Honor the parents. You have another commandment there, keep the Sabbath. Here's an example they give. So these are two absolutes. Honor the parents, keep the Sabbath. But when they come into conflict, you have to remember George Orwell's Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. You have to say all the 10 Commandments are absolute. They're all equal, but some are more equal than others in certain situations. So the example the Talmud gives is, suppose the parent says to the child, go and honor me by violating the Sabbath. Say on the Sabbath you're not allowed to make a fire. So the parent says, I'm cold, honor me by making a fire to warm me on the Sabbath. So you have a conflict of absolutes. Honor the parent, keep the Sabbath. They have to resolve this absolute conflict. And once you say that one is more absolute than the other, then neither are absolute anymore. So that's one way of framing the question.
What do the rabbis say to do there?
They say that you have to disregard the parent in order to honor the Sabbath because the parent is also obliged to honor the Sabbath.
What if the parent were sick?
If the parent were sick, it's something else. And this is a very good example. This was my next example, so glad you read my mind. Because in the first example I gave, it's a conflict of two absolutes. Two of the 10 Commandments. This example, with health, it's not one of the 10 Commandments. So in other words, here, where the rabbis would find that if making the fire, say, helped the parent, say, not die from exposure or something like this, then you would be allowed to do it, even though health is not one of the 10 Commandments. So it's not even an absolute conflicting with an absolute. It's something lower conflicting with an absolute. Now I'll give you a third example, which is even more stronger example.
Why can't you call that situation? Isn't that doesn't it depend on the situation?
I don't want to call it a situation because there's a whole area of ethics called situation ethics, which is is a packed phrase, and I don't want to use packed phrases because it's very often identified with Protestant ethics, and I don't want to get into that. So I'm trying to stay away from this and existential ethics and all this sort of stuff. The other example I wanted to give is suppose your parent says to you, do this, and your teacher says to you, no, don't do that, do this. Who do you listen to? According to Jewish law, you listen to the teacher, because the honor due the teacher is higher than the honor due the parent.
It doesn't say so.
That's exactly the point. Not only doesn't it say so in the Bible, only in the Talmud, which of course was written by the teachers. But what is the justification they bring in the Jewish legal codes for why you should honor the teacher? Because the teacher does the primary job that the parent is supposed to do, which is to teach you the Torah. In other words, you should honor the teacher higher than honoring the parent, because honoring the teacher is derived from honoring of the parent. Get it? Pardon me?
Well, in a sense, if you're saying the teacher honors the Torah, but a lot depends on what the teacher is teaching. If the teacher is teaching the Torah, then the teacher...
That's assumed. That's the kind of teacher we're talking about. That's the kind of teacher we're talking about. But the point I'm trying to make is here you have a law that is derived from, namely honoring the teacher, is derived from the honor due to the parent, and then is used to subvert the honor due to the parent, which is one of the absolutes that's in the Ten Commandments. See? So you don't have here absolutes. Now let's get to the example you gave before, and that's not the clash of absolutes. One is more absolute than the other, but the whole question of if something seems absolute, but then by interpretation, it is seen not to be absolute. So if not killing seems to be absolute, but the rabbis interpret that commandment of the Ten Commandments as don't murder, then it's a different story. Then self-defense becomes possible. Then war becomes possible. And I'll give you the biggie, abortion becomes possible. Because the Christian exegetes interpreted that commandment, you should not kill, and that became the basis for prohibiting abortion. You find it in St. Augustine. Jewish exegetes, interpreters, never interpreted abortion as murder. Never. Never as killing that's equated with murder. Never. So the process of interpretation is a way of making the law neither absolute nor relative. So this is one reason I would suggest Jewish law is neither absolute nor relativistic.
And that's why we're allowed to kill animals to eat?
No, you're allowed to kill animals to eat because of the covenant made with Noah, which gives you that permission. It's another business.
Did you just say that abortion was okay?
No, I didn't say okay. I just said it's not considered murder. I didn't say okay. We're going to have a whole discussion about it, but I'm going to bring you all the sources. Don't worry.
What about the first two commandments? In terms of I am the Lord your God, or you shall not put other gods before me. Those are, where would there be any sort of gray area there?
Well, that's a problem. I didn't say that none are absolute. I just said that they're not all absolute. But here too you would have the problem of interpretation. For example, what does that mean to bring other gods before God? What does that mean, idolatry? Say in our times, what does it mean, idolatry? Do we go according to what it literally means, or do we go according to what we interpret it to mean? Let me give you an example. In Hasidism, the definition of idolatry that they used was pride. Pride is idolatry because it considers the ego to be putting your own ego before God. So you should have no other lords before me. They interpret as meaning, especially your own ego shouldn't be before God. So, what does this mean? Or, for example, you have a debate. What kind of commandment, if it is a commandment, is the first commandment? I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt. Is this a commandment?
No.
It doesn't sound like a commandment.
No.
But the medievals mostly counted as a commandment to believe in God. Then you have the question debated by Maimonides and Nachmanides, which is the question Maimonides says it's a commandment. We have 613. This is the most important one. It's number one in importance. Nachmanides says, no, it's not one of the 613 commandments. It is the foundation for all the commandments. And because it's the foundation for all the commandments, it can't be one of the commandments. Because all the commandments are based on that. Because you can't have commandments unless you have someone doing the commanding, and that is God, and that's the foundation for all the commandments. So if you make it one of the commandments, say like not eating a cheeseburger, it puts it on the same level as that. Is it on the same level as that? Obviously not. But if you say that's a commandment and that's a commandment, it does. So I wouldn't say it's an absolute, but the question is, you have a hierarchy. Where in the hierarchy does it fit? Because you can't say they're all absolutes. You have to have some hierarchy. That's what the conflict of absolutes means. Now let me give you another approach that you find in the ethics of Judaism that suggests that it's a middle road between the absolute and the relativistic. And that is the idea I mentioned before, namely the idea of life as an art form. In other words, the issue in ethics is not whether it's absolutistic or relativistic. The issue is that if ethics is the way to build one's life as an art form, that's the issue. Not the issue of relativistic or absolutistic. In other words, the question isn't, should I observe all these rules or none of these rules or some of these rules? The question is, how can I make the life entrusted into my care by God into a work of art? That circumvents the whole issue of the relativistic absolutistic. In other words, if you have, and this professor I mentioned to you before, Christina Summers, about the people in the social ethics class who cheated, she says, if you spend all your time talking about ethics in terms of is war wrong, and is abortion wrong, and is this wrong and that wrong, things that people do not have on their immediate plate, and they can say, well, I like it or I don't like it. You're asking not the most important questions. She suggests that the most important questions in ethics is to ask the question, how can I be the person I want to be and should be? Good as I want to be. Back to Dennis Rodman. Or not bad as I want to be, good as I want to be. And then the whole ethical issue becomes something totally different. And then the moral values is not a question of defining them and what are they and what's their hierarchy, but it's a question of how do they function as building blocks to building one's life as a work of art. And this is also connected to the other idea I mentioned to you before of ethics as an aesthetics, that the beautiful, that the good is the beautiful. In other words, in this view, ethical values, what in Hebrew, medieval Hebrew is called midot, values, are not absolutes, but are rather guides or pathways or roadmaps or directional signals helping us to determine what kind of person we will become. And for Maimonides, for example, how one is going to apply these ethical values depends upon not some objective absolute truth, but depends upon certain predispositions of the person. Let me give you an example. In medieval medicine and ancient Greek medicine, there was the idea that the person has certain humors, they called humors, certain natural dispositions. And one idea was that, say, 4 of these dispositions are dry, wet, hot, cold. In other words, that certain people are naturally wet and moist, and certain people are dry, and certain people are dry and cold. So, for example, a person who flies off the handle angrily all the time, very irritable all the time, very jumpy all the time, this, for Maimonides, would be a person who is hot and wet. A person who is like ice cold all the time, very standoffish, never gets excited, cool, that's a person who's cold and dry. Now, in his view, either extreme is not good. And what's good is the middle. So a person who, say, is very, say, hot and wet, namely irritable and angry all the time, needs to utilize a moral virtue, say, like self-control, in a stronger way than a person who is dry and cold, who's always controlled, who's over-controlled. So how you utilize the virtues depends on your natural predispositions, and therefore there is no universal rule as to the application of the moral virtues. Get it? Or not? Okay, any questions to this point?
Is that for humors?
Humors is what they call them.
Like humor? H-U-M-O-R?
No, M-O-U-R. This is in, you have this in Galen, Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physicians.
Sometimes it was air, water.
No, those are the elements of the universe. These are the dispositions of the human being. And they believe that these, by the way, were connected with climate. Hot climates, people were hot. That's why they were hot. They came from hot climates. You can think about whether there's something to this. Yeah.
These principles you're articulating apply to individual behavior, how to do it, what is the right choice, and so on. Where does it come for me coercing you because you're deviating from some norm that I think is more appropriate for your behavior? That is, how does it go? What is the role of Jewish ethics on people who don't conform? More specifically, take a trivial anecdote, throwing stones if you drive a bus on Saturday or something.
Well, the question is, if you don't, it's a question of what you don't conform to.
Right, you're describing individual behavior, and you're going to follow a set of laws, and you're going to make the correct choices, and you're describing it as a one-on-one. What is your guide for your perfection and improving yourself and your moral behavior? The question is any of it, do I have an obligation to get you to conform to? Does it extend beyond?
Depends what I'm doing. Depends what I'm doing. What I'm going to suggest, I didn't have a chance yet to develop it, is that what we have here, in terms of a choice between the relativistic and the absolutistic, is a range of choices, all of which are moral, not simply this or that. I haven't yet had the chance to develop that. And I would say this is one of the geniuses of Jewish ethics, that you're not stuck always with one choice, that it's either this or this, but rather you have a variety of options. You don't have limitless options, but you have options. And if you choose any of the options that are available that can be defended within the tradition, then you're within the tradition, even though option A may be different than option B. If you go outside of those limited number of options, then you're outside. And then the question is, depending on what kind of action it is, depends on what action you're obliged to take to stop a person from doing it.
Could you give us an example?
An example would be if I, see you going into McDonald's, ordering a Big Mac or something like this. It's questionable whether I have a obligation to, say, risk my life running across Wabash Avenue in the middle of traffic to prevent you from doing that. But to give the Talmudic example in Sanhedrin, if I see somebody pursuing somebody else to kill them, I see someone stalking somebody to murder them, then I am obliged to, in certain conditions, try to stop them, even to the point of killing them and thereby preventing them from killing the other person. But I'm going to give a lot of examples in this when we discuss what it means, love thy neighbor as thyself, but that's a whole other issue.
What do you mean in certain conditions?
Well, for example, if I can kill that person, or I say I can maim that person, and thereby prevent him from killing an innocent victim without endangering my own life, without committing suicide. I mean, say the person who was the pursuer, who was pursuing the innocent person trying to kill him was Mike Tyson or Claude Van Damme or something like this. I'd be nuts to try to stop them, right? Or Schwarzenegger or one of these guys. I'd be crazy. But because I wouldn't survive that, that's for sure. But if I had a chance to stop them, even by wounding them, and it was no great risk to me, then for sure I have to do it. But if it's a risk, I'm not obliged to put my own life in peril to save somebody else. And this is, we're going to discuss in great detail in this whole question of you should love your neighbor as yourself. What does it mean? Who is the neighbor? What does this mean as yourself? We'll get to that.
Is it more important to protect your own life, not to risk it?
We're going to discuss this at some length.
In your parameters, you A, B thing, is it, can one thing be more moral than another? Can two things can both be moral?
Right.
Can one have,
Yes, of course one can be more moral
okay,
than another.
when you're looking at moral choices, don't you have the obligation, I don't know if you use that word, but obligation to take the higher, I mean, you limit your choices, don't you?
You limit your choices, but the situation already limits your choices. You don't have the obligation necessarily to take the higher road. It depends on what's possible. For example, you have, say, I mentioned before, a range regarding tzedakah and charity and stuff like this. So, gemilut chasadim is defined, acts of loving kindness there, by Maimonides as if you give away, say, more than 20% of your net worth. And the Talmud actually has a rule against giving away 20% more of your 20% of your net worth. Now, I would say if you're a person in retirement, living on a fixed income, pension, something like this, to give away 20% of your net worth when you don't know how long you're going to live and you don't know how long you need that money should not be an option. But if you're, say, worth $100 million, even if you're retired, and even if you're living on a fixed pension from the interest of the $100 million, if you shook loose 20%, you'd survive. So I think you have to take it.
You could manage.
Well, you wouldn't even, I don't think you'd notice too much. So you have to take it, you know, by the situation. In other words, what I'm suggesting is it's not the situation that creates the answer to the ethical question, and it's not the rule. It's both. I didn't want to get into that because you asked before, but you generally have the juxtaposition made between what's called the rule ethic and the situation ethic. And the rule ethic is you follow the rule when you're in a certain situation, no matter how the situation presents itself. And the other is that you decide what you're going to do when you're in the situation, on the spot. What I'm suggesting is that what we have here in Jewish ethics is a combination of both. That it's a rule ethic and a situation ethic. And that, at least in the Middle Ages, you have the idea developing that even the commandments of the Torah are not absolute. Because if they're absolute, they're ends in themselves. In the Middle Ages, you have the beginning of this idea that they're means to ends. Then the question is, what are they means to? What's the end they're a means to? But then they're not absolutes. I mean, it's very easy to have a clear-cut, in this situation you always do this. But what I'm suggesting, which is an absolutistic ethic, but what I'm suggesting is it doesn't work.
But if you did have two choices, and one is less ethical than the other, if we can make a judgment like that, and you happen to, for your own whatever reasons, you took the less, what you felt the less harmful, the less ethical.
Right.
Is that still ethical?
I would say yes, it is. But just as all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, certain actions are ethical and some are more ethical than others. For example, if I see a person on the street and the person comes over to me and says, I haven't eaten in 2 days. Can you give me some money? According to Jewish law, you are obliged to help that person. You have to help that person because it's tzedakah, it's the right thing to do. You can't examine that person. In other words, you can't investigate and find out whether they actually have eaten or not eaten, because in the meantime they might starve. I mean, if it's a life-threatening situation, you give now and ask questions later. So you're obliged to give. Now comes the question, well, if you have a $100 bill in your pocket and a $5 bill in your pocket, you could say, well, it may be more ethical to give them the $100 bill. Is it? I don't know. Certainly it would be more generous.
You'd do more good.
Depends what he spent it for. But maybe you would do more good. Maybe you wouldn't do more good. And then the question always is, who's giving the money? For example, suppose did you see the movie about John Gotti? What is it called?
The mafia guy?
The mafia guy, yeah. The Dapper Don. John Gotti, a friend, died from cancer. So he offered a hospital in New York $1 million to make a cancer ward, on the condition they name it the John Gotti Memorial Cancer Ward. The John Gotti Cancer Ward, in his honor, in Catholic Hospital. Well, it would do people a lot of good. Is it an ethical act to accept that money, considering how he made it? We're going to get into that, but I'm just saying that even, so suppose it was John Gotti walking down the street and the guy was there. And the guy knew who it was. Would it be ethical for him to take the money, or would it be, say, ethical for him to take the $5 because then he could get enough to eat to carry him over to the next day, but not ethical, that would be less ethical for him to take the $100 because he knows the $100 was made selling crack to kids? So you have to look at it both sides. So what I'm trying to say is that in ethics of Judaism, we have certain norms, we have certain rules, but you always have to see how the rules play out in the specific situation. So yes, it might be more ethical in one situation than another, but the question is, give me first the situation. Lon Fuller, who is a great American philosopher of law, has this idea called the ethics of obligation and the ethics of aspiration, that there are these two major levels of ethics. One is what we're obliged to do, and the other is what higher level, what we aspire to do. And what he argues is that the goal of the law, it doesn't always accomplish the goal, is to define the ethics of obligation, what we are obliged to do, what is the morally right thing to do. And then you have the ethics of aspiration, which is what one would hope you might do, but that we can't expect everybody to meet that standard. This is exactly the two levels I mentioned before, in Hebrew called tzedakah. We have to do it because it's right, not because we love the guy, want the guy, whatever. And then you have gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. This is like law of aspiration. This is what you aspire to do. Maimonides, for example, when he did his laws of charity, made, as you may know, famous 8 levels of charity. And what you have there is a scope. In other words, here are 8 kinds of ways of doing charity. Here's the least, here's the most. Anything in the middle is fine. So you aspire for the most, and you fulfill the minimal obligation in the least. But unless you have an idea of the least, then people wouldn't even do the least if they don't know what the least is. So that's why I'm suggesting a kind of multiple choice ethic, where you have many choices, not infinite choices, and if you choose within those options, it's an ethical act. The question of it's more or less depends on the situation. Now, in some situations, maybe one of those options would not work, would not be applicable. So you'd have fewer in that situation. But again, it depends on what that situation is. And as we'll see, this is the way it works out. Any other questions? Now, I want to raise a question that will, please.
I'm curious to know if the hospital accepted the...
No, it didn't expect it. I mean, it didn't accept the money, no. No, we had the same problem in the Jewish community with money from Ivan Boesky and Milken and all these other guys. Not exactly the same problem. Junk bonds and cocaine is not exactly the same thing, but still had this problem.
Would it have been different if he hadn't asked that his name be on the building?
Pardon me?
Would it have been a different response if he had asked?
He did.
His name, if his name, he had not requested that his name be on the wing of the building?
I don't know what the response would have been. It was a Catholic hospital. My guess, if it was a Jewish hospital, they would have taken the money. Because Milken just gave a tremendous amount of money to a Jewish organization on the condition that his name not be on what he endowed, and they accepted the money. But again, junk bonds is not Gotti. You know, if it had been, what's his name? Who is that guy? The Jewish mafiosi. Mayor Lansky, it may have been a different story. Because Mayor Lansky, you know, when he was dying, did offer $5 million to Israel to be let in as a contribution. Of course, he also offered it to Panama. And there is a theory that the reason he wasn't let into Israel is because the Tel Aviv mafia thought he was trying to move his mafia in there, not because they really believed he was dying. But that's a whole other business. It also would depend on what the purpose of the gift is for. But we will discuss this whole question of philanthropy because it's a very interesting question. It's a question of what the motive, does the motive of the donor have any implication on whether it fulfills the commandment or the virtue to give charity? Is it a fulfillment of charity? Or, for example, if a person gives a donation to a charity because his main or her main motivation is that, which is very common, that they'll get more business out of it. So it's really a kind of an investment rather than a charity gift. Does that fulfill? See that? But again, the question is the issue is how you frame the question. The way you frame the question is here: does it fulfill the commandment of tzedakah? It's not a question of do you have the right to do it, do you have the right to take it. The question is, does it fulfill this commandment? Does it meet the person's obligation? And is it permissible?
Well, I'm curious because with the mafia guy, if he doesn't ask for anything, no strings attached, and he just gives it, in a sense, isn't that money going to good, for a good purpose? Does it matter? I mean.
Well, that's the whole question. Is it the purpose or is it the intention of the donor? But to tell you the truth, if Sam Gotti said to me, I'm giving you money with no strings, I would be the tooth fairy. I believe in the tooth fairy first to believe him. Would you believe a mafia don would give you do anything without strings?
Who knows? I mean, maybe with them.
Well. All right, let me leave you with this issue, which is the issue I'm going to discuss next week. And that is the issue that has perplexed philosophers for thousands of years already. And this is the question, why should a person be moral? And what I'm going to suggest to you is that in the history of Western thought, there have been 4 major answers to this question. And then I want to compare the answers that were given in the history of Western philosophy and to the answers that are proposed in the ethics of Judaism.